All right, cool. I'm going to give us a sync. All right. What's up?
What's up?
We're here with Nikhil Chaudhary, and we're going to chat about a bunch of stuff. There's almost too much to talk about within the span that we have. But I think we're gonna start it off first because of what Nikhil's worked on. Why don't you tell us what cooperation is?
Sure. Well, I'll first start by saying so many social scientists are interested, and biologists and zoologists are interested in this problem of cooperation, and they define it differently, as you might expect, which causes all sorts of problems in the field because people are sort of approaching the problem from a similar starting point, yet using the word differently. It's certainly the way I use it does not correspond to the colloquial use. I'd say the colloquial use of cooperation is working together for some shared goal. I think if you ask someone in the general public what they mean by cooperation, they mean sort of working together to achieve something. Now, from sort of biological or ethological perspective, I probably would call that collaboration, maybe mutualism, depending on if they're the same species. And cooperation, the definition I give is the one based on, well, what is the fundamental puzzle here? So I would refer to cooperation in the way that lots of people refer to altruism, which is any behavior where at that point in time, at least, I'm incurring some sort of cost to myself to provide a benefit to some recipient. Then I am cooperating with them. And the currency, as an evolutionary scientist, the currency is fitness, the replication of genes in future generations. So I'm incurring a cost to my direct fitness to provide a benefit to the fitness of someone else. And then this is a puzzle, right? How could such behavior evolve if by definition you're reducing your own fitness and increasing the fitness of someone else?
So is it that collaboration is for a particular goal in a given moment, but cooperation is sort of this broader long-term mitigator of uncertainty for both of us?
I think it's more that collaboration, the reason I don't find that as puzzling and evolutionary scientists wouldn't find it as puzzling is that they're using, or I'm using that word to refer to working together to achieve something, right? And we're both going to benefit from it. So there's no real puzzle there. But if it's me, actually, you could almost see, with altruism, we're talking about me incurring a cost to provide a benefit to you. That's when there's really a puzzle, right? And I'm using cooperation synonymously with altruism. Because if we're all in a population, us three, and let's trivialize it, I have the gene which makes me cooperative. Me and you have a gene which makes us cooperative, i.e. we're willing to incur costs to provide benefits to others. And you happen to have a gene which makes you selfish. Then by our definition of cooperation, which means incurring fitness costs to provide benefits to others, your fitness is going to end up being higher than ours. So in the next generation, you've left relatively more descendants than us, so cooperative behavior should go extinct. This is the puzzle. It's effectively some form of sort of self-sacrifice to provide a benefit to another.
So you're talking about a pushback between this sort of like selfish gene concept that's put forward by Dawkins.
Yeah, well, the selfish gene concept is a way of reconciling this, right? Because it's at the individual level.
Yes.
By definition, yes, I'm incurring a cost, but at the gene level, my genes are gaining a net benefit if I cooperate with people who share those genes.
Yeah, right. And so this is sort of like almost an existential collaboration. You have something where I'm incurring a cost, you're benefiting, but ostensibly whatever benefits you also benefits me in the long run. Maybe I incur a cost in the immediate sense, but I have some kind of long run gain, or maybe that's the assumption of why it's difficult to reconcile, is because it seems like that's a good strategy. Evolution tells us it seems to be, even if on the immediate sense it's not immediately apparent.
Yeah, that's also, like, I have a question regarding that, because there are out there different explanations for what we call altruism, right? What seems to me is that you're using cooperation as synonymous to real altruism, which would be different than reciprocal altruism or other kind of theories like long run benefits or any other kind of exchange theory.
I'm actually using the word cooperation. I think possibly the best way to think about it is I'm using the unit that I'm describing as the behavior in that moment, right? So I'm going to call a behavior cooperative. I'm going to look at a given behavioral event and am I incurring a cost at that point in time via that event for you to gain a benefit? And that need not be true altruism, because reciprocal altruism, when I get that back, it's still satisfying my criteria. So that's one of the ways in which it's not true altruism, but it appears altruistic at that point in time.
I see.
We're almost saying, why is altruism not true altruism? But then you could say kin selection, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is true altruism.
I see.
It's like a global, local, temporal, in a temporal sense.
So it can be resolved temporally.
Yes.
And that was sort of, I think, what you were hinting at, that in the long run. But even if it's never reciprocated, then you've got the selfish gene kin selection. I don't know if you're familiar with Hamilton's rule.
Yep.
Then it doesn't need to be resolved. It's not a long run resolution. It's simply, if you share my genes and I cooperate with you, if the net benefit to you discounted by the degree of genetic relatedness is greater than the cost to me, there's been a net benefit to my genes, even though there's been a cost to me as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding exchange theories, so in the same token, what do you think about something that is, I find a little bit more controversial, and because it is, I believe, group selection. So what are your thoughts about ideas out there of alarm calls in primates, and do you think there is selection on group level that would lead to behaviors that can be described at the specific moment of that behavior occurs as altruistic?
So group selection, it's funny you mentioned alarm calls, because actually I think one of the first ways in which kin selection was validated was through alarm calls. One of the first ever studies was looking at ground squirrels and finding that actually when you look at when they do the alarm calls, it tends to be when their close relatives are around, and when other members of the group are around, they're less likely to do the alarm calls. But in general, group selection, I know there was this whole debate probably 5 to 10 years ago where there was a resurgence because of Sigmund Nowak. He had done all this complicated mathematics, and he was suggesting that group selection is a real phenomenon, and that actually kin selection has been overused as an explanation for understanding cooperation in the animal kingdom. And then there was this reply. This all happened in Nature, and there was this reply of, 100 different evolutionary scientists who all signed this paper saying kin selection is amazing, group selection is rubbish, or whatever. And I've never delved in the maths enough. I think group selection is just one of these things where theoretically, under the right conditions, genetic group selection can happen, but those conditions are unlikely to ever be met. So the problem with group selection, traditionally the problem is that as soon as you have a selfish individual in a group, the within group competition will supersede the between group competition, and the selfish individual within the group has a benefit. So then, altruism couldn't evolve via group selection. That's the problem. If you have any sort of migration or mutation which introduces variation within a group, then within group competition will supersede between group competition. For competition to happen, you need stable differences between units. So you can't have unless you have stable differences between groups, you couldn't have selection happening at the group level. And you can't have stable differences between groups because you have mutation or migration. Now, it's possible that if you had extremely large amounts of between-group competition, that actually, if that was really, really pronounced and there was not so much within-group variation, you could theoretically, like mathematically, have a scenario where between-group competition could supersede within-group competition.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that ever really happens with genetics because you've got migration and gene flow. But with culture, I'm sure you know, I do buy into cultural group selection because migration doesn't erode between group differences. When you enter another group, your genes don't change, but you can assimilate into the culture. And if you don't, you're going to get punished if you don't follow the social norms. So then you can have stable differences between groups. And then if you've got those, you can have selection at the group level for different cultural repertoires. And those groups which have cultures which promote patriotism, sacrifice for the good of the group, those are the groups which do well. And those cultural traits, I mean, if you look around within groups, it's always about doing for the good of the group, maybe having hostility towards other groups, patriotism, self-sacrifice. These are all cultural virtues that seem to have done very well for obvious reasons. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. I think you just come to my mind that what actually for culture Hichard and Boyd would actually said that these conditions, this very specific kind of conditions existed, and that's why you're so special to have developed.
And with culture, the reason it works, so again, just to recap, with genetics, for group selection to occur, you need between group competition to be really pronounced to supersede within group competition. And there was actually a really cool paper where they tried to quantify the level of variation and between group difference in pairs of populations, both at the gene level and the cultural level. So, of course, for the genetic data, that's obvious. You just get the genetics from two groups and calculate like an FST value, which is quantifying the amount of genetic difference. And then for culture, what they did was they looked at the World Value Survey, which is the survey where you ask all these sort of questions like, what do you think about abortion? So it was sort of about values, obviously, World Value Survey. And then they computed FST differences, so between group differences in culture. And what they showed basically is, you know, you've got so much more variation between groups in culture than you do in genes, that allows for the possibility of selection at the cultural level, because it's much more easy to supersede within group competition because there's much more variation in culture between groups than within groups. Whereas with genes, it's the opposite. The vast majority of genetic variation can be found within groups. And I suppose it's one of the important mechanisms for the adaptability of a species is that you have the ability to move between groups. As your group becomes devalued, the entire group doesn't go extinct. They can actually separate out, find different groups, assimilate in. And if there's a huge difference between groups genetically, then you're going to have either speciation, and one group might die off, one group might survive. They might both survive and eventually become genetically even more different. Sure.
But, you know, with it's kind of made irrelevant when you come to humans because of how many of us there are, how we've sort of transcended this food chain where you can get this great degree of polarization between groups where the group differences are so large that it's very difficult to move between ideological groups. But it can be really easy to move into a new, say, genetic group if the cultural differences aren't too vast.
Yes.
Yeah, it's almost like we've created this phenomenon which might be novel, probably is, in the animal kingdom where our cultures can be so vastly different that even if you're ostracized from your group, you might look to the opposing group or you might look to an entirely new one. Or it might be that you find no groups to attach yourself to. And then you kind of go on this whole radical binge, which we see a lot, especially in today's, and maybe the group is something like a radical fringe that you find online because it's so niche. But it's a strange sort of phenomenon that ends up happening.
Yeah, I think traditionally, there's a lot of stuff going on now and radical stuff, and everyone's also obsessed with finding their passion, etc. And these aren't bad things, but it's a consequence of the fact that of affluence, really. When your basic needs aren't being met, you really need to be in a group, and therefore you're willing to assimilate culturally. And it's only when you've got real affluence and you're able to be independent that you're sort of willing to rebel against the social norms, because you feel this sense of you're able to do so. When you were speaking about that and the sort of uniqueness of cultural variation in humans compared to other species, it made me think, and migration and movement between it made me think of this one paper we did, and it was a similar narrative to some experimental work, which was talking about trying to understand why human culture, in terms of our knowledge, skills, and technologies, is so elaborate compared to other species. So I don't know if you're aware of this concept of cumulative culture, which is basically that, yes, unlike in other species, we transmit information and build technologies and knowledge bases which are beyond what one individual could ever build themselves. And the reason social structure has probably played a really important role in that, because of the amount of migration between groups, then there's more sharing of ideas. But what's not so intuitive is initially the narrative was just, we have so much migration between groups and we can look back in the past and map out population densities, how much movement there was between groups, and you see these cultural explosions in the archaeological record, which happened when you had the right demographic conditions, that people were moving around enough and subgroups were exchanging information and recombining information in novel ways. But what's quite cool is what's ideal is not this sense of as much movement of ideas or as much mobility and exchange of ideas is better. Sometimes less is more. What you actually want is what we call partial connectivity. So this experiment that they did basically involved, I won't go into the details of it because it's quite hard to explain, but what they found, they had two conditions, and you've got a bunch of people separated into groups, say into pairs, and they're trying to solve some problem. And this problem has multiple solutions. And the best solution you can get involves combining two of the earlier solutions, which aren't quite as good. And when you have a system where there's full connectivity, so everyone has a go in their pairs at solving this problem and has different results, and then in the next generation, in the next round, everyone moves to a different group. So everyone's sharing ideas constantly. Each round, ideas are moving. You do get to a good solution quickly because someone finds something good and then they move and they share it and then they move and they're both sharing it. So you've got this exponential, rapid shift towards this good solution. But when you have partial connectivity, where you stay in your pairs for 5 rounds and then you move, then you get better outcomes because you don't get stuck in one trajectory. When you've got full connectivity, as soon as someone gets a good solution and shares it really rapidly, everyone's like, okay, that's the way. And you get stuck in this one path. And yeah, you get rapid cultural adaptation and solution. But when you've got partial connectivity, people are working out different things and they can follow different trajectories. And in the way they set up this experiment where the ideal solution involved combining solutions which were on slightly different trajectories, then that partial connectivity is ideal. And in hunter-gatherer societies, you really do have partial connectivity because you're staying with your group, you're staying in your camp, but then every so often a family will move to another camp. So you're interacting with the same people for a few weeks and then you move to another camp and share some information. But it's not like information is constantly moving every day. People are doing their own thing and then moving and sharing ideas at this sort of gradual rate.
Yeah, that's sort of it's an interesting thing that happens, I guess, within academia as well, where you get certain labs stagnating because you have a persona at the top, sort of running it for a long time, but people move between laboratories, and as a whole, science progresses because there are so many different laboratories doing interesting things.
Yes.
But if you have one person and they dominate the narrative, scientific narrative within a domain, you're kind of going to get stuck for a while.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's so well recognized now in science, but actually implementing the ideal structure and interdisciplinarity and movement of ideas at the right rate is so difficult to achieve.
But most of the universities do avoiding research in breeding, right? So is that bad for science?
They're avoiding it. Yeah. I mean, but now if you apply for a grant, you've got a much better chance if you show that it's interdisciplinary and you've got people from very different departments working on it. So I think there is an encouragement towards this
in breeding,
cross-fertilization.
what I meant is that universities would avoid PhDs becoming post-PhDs in the same department or lab, and becoming professors. So they should be moving around, right?
Of course, right. They're avoiding sort of intra-breeding and of course, that's a good thing. I think.
But we are missing out on people working on the same problem within the same partial connections for a longer period, right?
Well, I guess it depends what period is partial connectivity. I don't know what that optimal amount of spending time, but I think the reality is right now we're in a situation where there's too much isolation, so any of that mobility is good. But eventually you would get to a point where maybe there's too much.
And what do you think of the migration of ideas within the environment of today's internet? So is this too much migration of ideas? Or it's actually, it happens on a kind of the same scenario of partial connectivity at some degree, and to which degree?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, whenever I just think about the internet now, I just feel so disillusioned when thinking about the information space. I mean, I haven't been thinking about it with respect to, we've just got full connectivity and just in this mess of not even solving problems. And we don't even have the first step. So with partial connectivity, when it works really well, is when people are incrementally working out what works and what doesn't work, and then they change. And we don't even have that basic first step of knowing what works and what's true and what's not true. So that whole process of sort of cumulative transition of ideas, at least when it comes to things like politics or solutions to health problems, has got worse because you don't even have that base layer of knowing whether you're in the right direction or not. We have no idea what's true or not. And they're often about long-term things, like whether celery juice does cure cancer. You're not even in a place to say and then share the idea. But I don't think it does cure cancer.
But yeah, I guess that gets to a really important point, which is that humans seem to be able to adapt to any type of context. And the internet is such a different type of context than we've ever seen before. And this was briefly mentioned when we were chatting yesterday, but that sort of the phenotypic plasticity seems to be one of the core advantages that humans seem to have. It seems to be our core evolutionary advantage. And it's a conversation that I end up getting into a lot these days with things like ChatGPT is, a lot of people like to think of art as this marker of humanity. What humans can do that other species cannot. But it seems like because GPT can so remarkably copy poetry from specific artists, images from particular artists, it seems like the core thing that you can tell, the core metric you can use to tell whether or not a human touched something is the ability, the degree of adaptability within a certain capacity. So GPT is good at doing the things GPT is good at, but human beings can rapidly adapt to any type of context. And it seems like the ability to adapt is much more human than the ability to make art. the ability to do science. It seems like that the ability to say, okay, what do I need to do to match the context? The ability to identify a question, act on the question, seems to be a fundamental human trait. And maybe this is sort of a social way of thinking about the type of plasticity that we talk about at the phenotypic level.
Yeah. The emphasis people put on art, and this is, I've always found these sort of things a bit circular. It's sort of like, well, we value art as humans, and then we sort of say what makes us special as humans is that we value art. I mean, of course, the things that we're going to say is special about our species are going to be the things that we as a species value. I mean, I've always found that very strange. The adaptability and the cultural adaptability, though, is certainly that thing. That it's because you see phenotypic plasticity in loads of species, right? You get so many species which can have like epigenetic responses to local environmental variation. Now, because we've been colonized a much broader set of environments, there might be more plastic responses, but it's really the mechanism is that we've got the flexible responses through culture and through information, which I think is what you were getting at when you said culture and then phenotypic plasticity, because our phenotypic plasticity is often mediated by culture rather than like epigenetic processes. And I always say to my students when I'm introducing cultural evolution, we can do it now, I show them a heat map of this one taxa, and it's ants, because I really like ants, and they're all over the place, and you just see that ants are basically everywhere except the Arctic. And then I ask them, how many species of ants are you? And if you map it, if you look at the heat maps, there's some, human heat maps sort of similar. They're everywhere, and we're in the Arctic too, in terms of the terrestrial globe. But how many species do you think there are of ant? Have a guess.
I would say something around 20,000.
Amazing. The estimates are about 22,000. We haven't found them all, but there's some way of estimating. Okay. And then we colonized the same places as one species, and it's the phenotypic plasticity and rapid adaptation is so cultural. We are still one species. It's not so much biological plasticity as cultural plasticity. I can't actually remember the question we started with there.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's quite phenomenal, because you get much less complex forms of biological life that are able to adapt to their environments really rapidly. But you have humans at the very far end of sort of biological complexity, especially something like the human nervous system. But then you have this the nervous system creating something abstract as sort of a system that it operates under, which is culture, that can then extend its capacity beyond just the genetic limits.
Yes, that's it, right? Often when we're thinking about adaptability, and sometimes I think human behavioral ecologists, so within the evolutionary social scientists, human behavioral ecologists, the premise is an adaptationist stance, which means we basically assume there are no constraints on adaptability. And yes, we have culture, but there are still constraints, especially when you get a rapid change in environmental shift. It takes a while for culture to adapt as well. But I completely agree with what you're saying. With biological adaptation, you've got phylogenetic constraints. So if a species is exposed to some new environmental challenge, which is really novel, and if you look phylogenetically across all its relatively close relatives and their shared common ancestors, this problem hasn't been there. All of that genetic architecture that's been built up has not been designed to deal with this new problem. And as we mentioned yesterday, I can't remember what we were discussing, natural selection builds on what's already there. So phylogenetic constraints are a real phenomenon when it comes to biology, especially if you have a really new environmental problem, which you don't have the genetic architecture for already. But then with culture, the constraints are just not there. There is no real constraint.
Yeah, especially with humans where our breeding time is so much longer than our like cultural breeding time.
Yeah.
Cultures can shift so fast based on what we need, but it takes a very long time to get a genetic shift. But a cultural shift, you could say, almost happens every generation. You have sub-generational cultural shifts.
So with genes, the tradition you talk about vertical transmission, it's parents to offspring.
Mm-hmm.
And then with culture, you've got vertical transmission, but it can be bidirectional and it can be weighted. Maybe I learn more from my dad than mum. Then you've got oblique transition. I learn from the generation above, but it's my teachers, not just my parents. And then, of course, you've got horizontal transmission within generations. And as you say, so you can have within generation cultural change. And yes, that allows for rapid adaptation, but it also allows for maladaptation, right? Because vertical transmission, like with genes, if there's a genetic trait which reduces reproductive success, it reduces the chance of survival or reproduction, then via vertical transmission, by definition almost under the conditions I just gave, that genetic trait is going to reduce in frequency. That's what natural selection is. If you've got heritability, vertical heritability, and competition, and you've got something that reduces fitness, it's going to lower in frequency. If smoking was purely genetically determined, it would be extinct. But it can be, it's transmitted culturally and is often transmitted horizontally. So actually, whilst culture can change so quickly and isn't just transmitted vertically, that allows for much faster adaptability and change, but equally it allows for the persistence of maladaptive and even pathological behaviours too. Mm-hmm. So there are pros and cons of it when you're thinking we can respond really quickly, but we wouldn't be smoking if that was genetically determined.
Yeah, and I suppose you have this interesting thing where the genes you inherit are the genes you inherited, but the culture you inherit, you can deviate from massively, for better or for worse. But then also you can get this thing where offspring can impact the culture that parents maintain.
Yeah.
And I think you end up seeing this a lot, which is also really interesting because you can have children, they can change your worldview, and then you can be going about your world also impacting other people's worldview.
Yeah.
So that's I guess sort of a very novel thing that maybe just very cultural animals will do and humans sort of excel at.
Yeah.
You can change your mind over time. And yeah, sure, there's some degree of adaptability, I suppose, to your epigenetics through your lifetime. There's some kind of agent-centric phenotypic change, but the cultural variation is huge.
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned like the reverse and changing your parents' minds of something. I mean, that we're all experiencing such a change in the zeitgeist and the moral values, and maybe I'm just at that age now. Every generation there's the tension that happens with the new moral values that emerge, and suddenly all 20-year-olds think their parents are super backward and conservative, and all the parents think their child is just going through a phase, which they often are just going through a phase, or sometimes the cultural norms stick. But that's happening so profoundly now, and it's such a drastic shift. I've noticed seeing a lot of my colleagues who are older, seeing it's such a powerful shift that's going on in the zeitgeist and in culture, particularly around morality, seeing this interesting trend of having seen them have discussions with their kids, and they're almost subordinated by their kids, and they're sort of they're being deferent towards their children and saying, yeah, they're taking on their values, partly because we're also in a situation now where values are, the consequences of not adhering to certain people's values are really severe, and there's a culture of fear around this too. But it's interesting to see this happen, where you're seeing parents being subordinate to their children when it comes to their morality, because I don't know how much that's happened before.
Yeah, that's a super interesting topic. I think I would deviate from that with what I had in mind, because we have been talking about phenotypic plasticity, and I think the culture is part of is a phenomenon of niche construction, right? So we are we do not only have this band of adaptability on our behavior that can go well, in a certain spectrum within the environment, but we are also shaping the environment around us, and that kind of constrain what we are bringing on our genes, or like the things that we have inherited genetically, but also gives our phenotypic plasticity some things to work with, right?
Yeah.
And I think niche construction is such an interesting way to look at how humans, the way that we build our society, and how that in turn change the way that we behave in general. And I see broadly culture as part of niche construction, but there are very interesting things that we do, right? In terms of shaping our environment, that it's nothing akin of ants building an ant mound or anything like that. Like, we are fundamentally changing ourselves biologically all the time. That's super crazy. I think it's an interesting thought, but it has so much potential of explaining some of the behaviors that we find puzzling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, isn't that, even outside of culture, isn't that always going on? Just, I always say, when introducing sociality on one of my courses, I think usually the prime mover towards a species becoming social is predation. So the sociality is the response to this selection pressure. And then as soon as you've got sociality, that becomes one of the most fundamental selection pressures of all, because then you've got within group competition, and all these different social adaptations are happening rapidly. I've always found niche construction, I don't know the idea very well. I mean, I know I should, because it's a really famous idea. I was speaking with my friend the other day, and we were talking about a book that should be written about certain words which are used, and sometimes no one really knows what they mean, or people are using them in very different ways. Cooperation was one of them. Niche was one of them. She's got a paper coming out on something to do with niches, and then even though she's now an expert in it, she keeps asking me, what is a niche? And I'm like, I don't really know. And I think people are using that word in quite different ways. Fitness was one as well. Sometimes when I talk to geneticists, I thought fitness was a really basic concept, but we're seemingly on different wavelengths about that. But so niche construction theory, I mean, are you basically, when you're talking about culture, you're just saying that we're using our culture in a way that ends up having profound effects on the selection pressures we're exposed to.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's really a shit with this like gene culture co-evolution. It's such a cool thing. And I think you're so right. It's so important. And when we try and think of really well-established examples of this, which have been quantified, where we can really show the evidence for it, it's always the same thing, lactase persistence. Yeah. It's always, if you look at genes which allow for lactase persistence, it maps onto the cultural trait of how long a population has been dairying for or whatever. And it would just be really lovely to have some more well-studied quantitative examples of gene culture co-evolution, which are really well-established and clear. Here's the evidence. Because obviously, like you say, it's huge. It's such an important force. I've got one of the master's students in my department right now is looking at alcohol metabolism in some East Asian populations because they metabolize alcohol differently, and whether you can predict this based on and the genes related to it, whether you can trace them back to the onset of rice farmers starting to make their own alcohol, and that will make for a really nice gene culture co-evolution example if it works out well.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the I work with identity a lot, just how identity emerges, what its function might be. And I think I deal with how identity might just be a means of building a socio-ecological niche to sort of fit in to serve that role of within group competition. So increasing your fitness, another term, increasing your fitness within your group is building out an identity that is somehow distinct. There is something that I provide to the group. And once that's threatened, then my position within the group is threatened. That can increase my anxiety about belonging. This threat of ostracism is sort of ever present. And so the the desire to project something into the social world is what I try to maintain that concept in my mind, but also in the minds of others. So I'm sort of managing my reputation. So this socio-ecological niche is, not just how I navigate my social environment, but what my social environment is nested in. So maybe what I can provide to the group from outside of the group. What do you think about that?
Well, it was funny when you first started saying that, and before you said about being distinct, I immediately was thinking, identity, it's about feeling merged with the group and being at one with the group. And then you said distinct, and it's sort of happening on two levels, right? I think with any group, you need to feel like you're part of a group, i.e., you're all the same. That at this level of analysis, you're all the same, and you truly do belong. And equally, to feel that, to some degree, you need to feel valued in the group, for which you need to be distinct from other people in the group and offer something different. And there's this, it's sort of simultaneously you want to be the same, but different at this lower level. But yes, my immediate reaction is I always think of identity as largely constructed with the first thing that comes to mind is belonging. But maybe you can repeat what you're saying and what you're thinking about being distinct and offering value and how that plays into inside.
With belonging is an interesting idea. I tend to see group as more affiliation based. So I don't belong in a group, or I'm not in a group, but I comprise the group. I'm one component in it. So I see it as an affiliation in that I can even say that you two are part of the same group, but you two might not believe you're part of the same group. This thing happened. I think a classic example is something like Maoists and Marxists, Maoists and Leninists, who maybe from the outside people might be like, oh, these are part of the same group. They're both fundamentally communists or something. But they might, if they see each other on the street, they might try to kill each other. You get groups or something where a third party can also attribute something like affiliation between two people. But it really depends on whether those two people feel as though they're affiliated.
Yeah.
In the same sense, you two can form a group and I can think that I'm part of it, but you two might not think that I'm part of it. So there's this sort of interesting thing where, I might want to belong, but I don't think that I ever want to belong to a particular group. I just want to belong to groups. And then whatever groups sort of fit the rest of that niche, that socio-niche that I've built, are the groups that I'm going to try to affiliate with. So if I get ostracized from one group, I'm not going to join typically not the radically different group. I might join some kind of adjacent group that still fits in with the rest of my identity. So I don't have to change all of my groups and map myself onto a different person.
Yeah.
But there is a sort of sets of groups that I feel are not incongruent with one another. And so I affiliate with those. And my affiliation might change based on what the needs of myself, my maintenance of my group affiliations might change. So my affiliation with one group might necessitate that I distance myself from another group, or might necessitate that I also affiliate with an adjacent group.
Yeah, when you were saying that, two things that came to my mind. One was this, I totally agree that goes on, but this is, again, a relatively novel phenomenon of even having choice over group membership, especially if you're living in a small community. Yes, there's often structuring within the community, but it's sort of like this is your group, and you don't have the same level of control over who you're affiliating with. Of course, in large-scale societies like us and they're market integrated, then you've really got these options and you've got lots of groups emerging. But I was also thinking, actually, often leaving a group either because you've been ostracized or so you've either been pushed out of the group and rejected, or you voluntarily want to leave the group for whatever reason. I think that can often come with actually not going for an adjacent type of group. Like I think about a lot of people who grow up and as part of a religious group, which then they reject, and you get this really extreme, like they go for the hardest core atheists. Like I even remember when I first really started questioning, I was brought up a Hindu, although not particularly, my parents aren't super religious or anything, but when I first started questioning it, as I started to be like, oh, it's not really for me, which actually maybe it's changed a bit now, then it's just this rebellion to the one group I really want to be part of and matters to me is to go as far away as possible from the group I was in. But certainly in other contexts, particularly in some contexts where you're more pushed out of the group rather than voluntarily leaving it, then, yeah, you maybe try and find the next best thing.
Yeah, I think it really depends on how long that discontentment festers.
Yeah.
Where you get also some people with political opinions doing drastic shifts. And I think it really depends on how many beliefs you sort of start maintaining that become incongruent with that group. If all of a sudden you reach a tipping point and you accept that you have so many beliefs that are incongruent with the group, you might shift to the radical opposite. But if it's there's also ways in which you can kind of get a gradual change, a gradual drift away from a religion or towards a religion, and vice versa with any political affiliation.
For sure.
But yeah, there's an interesting sort of thing because you study hunters and gatherers societies. Do you think there's a difference in the type of identities we maintain in this sort of fully integrated globalist sort of society versus the ones in hunter-gatherer? I mean, we maintain so much. I mean, every time I walk down the street, I've curated myself, my physical appearance to such a high degree, and I've curated my social opinions to such a high degree. Is there to me that there must be some kind of drastic difference between the complexity of the identities, right?
I think it might be actually what we started with, which is the degree to which identity does happen, what level it does happen at. Now, of course, it's happening at these different levels, but what you're describing, and I think what goes on a lot more in our society, yes, we want to feel like part of some larger group, and that feeds into our own identity too. But identity can be this very individual thing about me and how I specifically as an individual fit in to different groups that may exist, but it's about my place in them. And I think the concept of separateness can be quite different in other cultures, where identity really is about you all being part of this same thing. And when you think about ritual, which it doesn't matter whether you're looking at football fans, fraternities, religious rituals, songs in hunter-gatherer societies. I mean, what they tend, the unique ingredients which seem to turn up time and time again is synchrony, right? Movement in synchrony or chanting in synchrony. And the physiological effects of that are now well established. You know, cortisol levels reduce, oxytocin levels go up, merging of the self and other starts to happen. And you guys probably know more about this than I do, but there are various tests they use to try and sort of measure the degree to which one feels distinct from their group, or I don't even know what the word is, or merged with their group. And the degree to which your self-esteem is tied in with the quality of your group or your group standing versus you as an individual or your comparison with other people as a group. All of this synchrony seems to be, pushing one's identity to happen more at the level of the group than the level of themselves. And I think about the rituals you see in many small-scale societies. In with the Bayaka, they have all these Masana songs and dances where the forest spirits come, but people are singing in synchrony and moving in synchrony. And you can have Miyayo, where this is going on all night long. And if you do this for 13 hours in a row, you sort of enter a slightly different state of consciousness. And there really is this profound level of social bonding with others and a sense of, that's sort of the meditative state is often about removing identification with the self, and that sort of happens when you're doing this repetitive. I mean, tantric meditation is sort of that. You're like chanting, and that's even yourself. That by chanting and chanting repetitively, you sort of slightly lose your sense of self and some automatic state. And then when you're doing that with other people, it's sort of. I actually had a thought about this, and this is probably, I know absolutely nothing about neuroscience or virtually nothing, but I was thinking part of the reason I know this is my hand, right, is that I put it down and now so I send a motor control and I'm getting visual feedback that my hands move down. I'm getting auditory feedback. So that's, to some degree, I believe, part of the process of me knowing this is my hand, because there's a correspondence between the external stimuli and the motor command I've given. And then I was thinking, well, maybe if you're moving in synchrony with everyone, and we're all doing this in synchrony, I'm sort of doing this motor command, but then I'm also getting the visual and auditory feedback from what you guys are doing too. And somehow maybe that's merging my sense of, I get the sense that this is my arm because I'm getting the feedback in synchrony with my motor commands. And I don't know, maybe some part of the affective and social responses to moving in synchrony is related to that in some way. And I'm sure a neuroscientist might be like, that's complete rubbish. But maybe there's something in that I'm getting external feedback of your movement to my motor commands.
I've got two things for you. One is anecdotal. The other one is scientific.
Okay, sure.
Oh, first, the thing you were talking about with the measure of the individual as being part of a group is prototypicality.
Okay.
So that's actually the measure used to say, okay, how much do I feel I'm part of the group, and how much does the group feel I'm actually part of them? And that's a measure that's used, and then things like stress levels and anxiety levels are measured against one's prototypicality. So the threat of atypicality and ostracism are sort of synonyms in this sense.
But there isn't what you're describing more about, to what degree do I feel I'm integrated and embedded within the group, like, as opposed to the sense that I am the group. I mean, I don't know if I'm explaining this well, or maybe I've misunderstood it, but isn't there a concept of the degree to which my identity sort of becomes the group as well, like my sense of separation from the group
Something
starts.
more related to joint action kind of research? So
maybe,
you know what I mean, like playing a song together and then being able to capture that missed note on the piano when you're playing at the same time, and you kind of, okay, I have to correct that because
right,
I am in the same kind of brainwave.
Yes,
it's like blurring of the lines.
Yeah, it's
I see
jointness or
so that makes sense with the so you're following up with the meditation sort of as like a full blurring of the lines and practices that we might do that sort of enhance this blurring of,
and then you're doing it with
my
all these
agency
other
in the moment.
people as well.
Yeah. So there's so with the physical body, the interesting thing is it's not just a motor function that goes in one direction. We actually send a forward copy and a backward copy. So we have these effort signals that go backwards. So as I speak, the fact that I'm speaking, there are so many things going on. One is I'm actually producing the speech, and the other thing is that to other parts of my brain, there are copies of the signal sent, and it almost like reduces the noise. So as I move my hand, there's both the signal to move my hand and the signal saying that's your hand moving. And if that signal goes, you actually have disorders where the efference, the whole efference system collapses, and the moving of the hand won't be recognized.
Right.
And so that's a very interesting sort of phenomenon.
In cognitive science, we can call it inactivism.
I suppose you can call it inactivism. When that breaks down, if that disintegrates, you've lost your inaction, and that's a really interesting thing.
Mm-hmm. But how was that experience then when that happens?
I wouldn't be I wouldn't be recognizing my hand. So you get something similar in maybe this is a different tangent, but in something like a split brain experiment, you can get something where there's an action performed and it's not recognized. Yeah. So when you cut the corpus callosum, you're losing the efferent signals to the other side.
Yeah.
So you get this inability to recognize your own motor function because the efferents copies are not being sent.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thing when you overload, when you have this theory of cognitive load, the amount of stimuli you can process at a given time, where people feel overwhelmed. They stop taking in, or they stop processing the stimuli. And I think there's an interesting point where you reach just before that, where you can get into something like this group kind of state, like a drum circle, like dancing around a fire, like a religious ritual, which I think Hinduism probably does more intensely, more powerfully than anybody else, because there's so much sensation all at once. But yeah, I think there's something to that, where you have to almost suspend your ability to process every facet of your environment, which we want to do at every moment. You have to kind of suppress some of that because you're overloaded with so much, and you sort of lose yourself in quotes, and you sort of become part of the moment.
Yeah, yeah. God, when you're speaking, there's always so many things that I mean, what you were describing almost, it's not quite the same process, but it's like the inverse of phantom limbs. You know about phantom limbs?
Yeah.
There you've got, you think of something is yourself and your own, and it doesn't even exist. But what were you saying after that now? Yes, it just reminded me of group, this sense of being overloaded and how it relates to groups. One of the things that can actually drive the formation of groups, as I say, I think sociality, the most common denominator in what drives its evolution is predation defense. And there are all sorts of, as long as you're not nocturnal, because if you're nocturnal, the best way to avoid predators is to be inconspicuous. So being part of a group isn't great. But if you're diurnal, being part of a group has various advantages. And one of them is called the confusion effect. So if you put a bunch of fish next to some other predator fish, I mean, it only happens with some species, you'd think, okay, if there are 3 fish and then we put the predator in, the predator's got only 3 fish, so they may get one, they may not. You put in 15 fish and you're like, okay, now the predator's probably going to get one. There's so many of the fish available. But what happens is all the fish have this adaptation where they all just dart in different directions. There's this cognitive overload. The predator just can't function. And the more and more fish you put in and the more and more prey there are available, the less able the predator is to actually be successful in getting prey. So these large groups where they have this sort of shared adaptation of just darting around in different directions get this benefit, because there you've got sociality and doing everything in a non-synchronous way, having a benefit of predation defense.
Yeah, especially if they're reflective and they have all these other mechanisms. I suppose zebras having stripes. You have all these different mechanisms to overload and confuse. Reduce the contrast. Between individuals, and then all of a sudden you get this swath.
But you don't really need any form of complex sociality if that's basically just a group movement. Avoiding predation, right? So it's nothing complex in terms of sociality.
Just being
being together.
I tend to try and distinguish between a society and an aggregation, and that can just be an aggregation.
Okay.
And one of the main reasons Hamilton's thing was the selfish herd, right? You don't need to have any coordination or anything. Simply by virtue of being around other individuals, you're less likely to be the one who the predator takes.
Because I was thinking, another thing that actually is beneficial of being around others, of other conspecifics, and actually can drive to complex sociality is information. So if you are around other conspecifics, you are surrounded by other individuals that can provide you with information that leads you to survive better, right? Where there is food, where to run, I don't know, many different things, right, regarding information. And at the other, you can easily make the argument of stepping up on this information, right? Starting to use information together, for example. And you're talking about togetherness or the sense of togetherness. It just, I don't know why it reminded me of Hutchings' Cognition in the Wild.
You have to tell me.
Okay, so it's a cognitive ethnography of how people would work together to, I don't have the word now, really large boat, like a boat that is really large. So they are navigating together. They are in this cockpit of a boat, and they have many different controls, and they all have a little bit of information of what is going on, where they are, what they have to do, and the information is just flowing between them as if it was just one brain kind of navigating this really large boat together. So you can come from just like, okay, I have a bunch of conspecific around me. I'm seeing how that guy is getting food. Therefore, I can use the same technique to get food as well, to the point that, okay, let's put those brain together and let's use a very complex way to language to transfer information between us to make something that is really complex to do.
Yeah.
Right.
Although it's interesting that social learning and transmission of information is actually restricted. It happens a lot in the animal kingdom, but it'd still be a majority of social species where social learning doesn't happen. So either it's really cognitively costly, and as such it doesn't always evolve, or the benefit it provides for lots of these species isn't actually that large. So it really, I guess, depends on what selections pressures they're having, whether that investment's actually worth it. I think actually one of the best hypotheses now for variation in primate brain size is based on social learning, right? Initially it was how complex is their foraging niche, then it was like how complex are their social groups, but then it's like, well, orangutans don't necessarily have that much of a complex social group, they've still got big brains, and then it's more now thought to be about social learning, and that there is this big investment in growing a larger brain because being able to socially learn isn't actually that cheap. But when you can, the benefits are very, very large.
No, makes sense. Yeah. Going to take a hook on the topic?
If you have anything else to say, otherwise I would like to speak a bit about isolation.
No, go ahead.
Because it's something that you touched upon yesterday, and I think is sort of an interesting application of the work that I also find really interesting. Sort of both the social pressures that drive individuals towards isolation, what we find when we see extremist ideation or extreme behaviors, how it seems like social pressures end up driving people towards individualism, but then also how we've built cultures of individualism, which sort of say, well, you ought to rely on yourself, and almost the fetishization of doing things on your own, and how that tends to be quite harmful for individuals. So if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, I think it is harmful. Someone asked a question very related to this yesterday about, because that does seem to be something really propagating, and I don't know, again, there's so much echo chambers. I don't know how much other people are exposed to it, but it seems to be that I'm exposed to it so much that I imagine this is something really growing exponentially, this obsession with self-reliance. And of course there's value in that, but I do feel a bit of a sense of you really commit to that if you want. And I think there's truth in the Eastern philosophies about being detached and cultivate it. You can't control your external world. So if you really cultivate inner equanimity and contentment, then great, that works. It's so, and actually I think often what spirituality or the Eastern traditions or whatever we want to call them, what they really are is saying, well, a lot about our nature makes us unhappy. So if you want to be content, you need to just learn to completely overcome what is natural to you. And when you think about what it really is, that being a devout monk or sadhu is, it's largely about completely rescinding these natural drives or what's natural to the bonds you forge or whatever. Now, in our culture, this emphasis on self-reliance I don't know. I've always just, I mean, I haven't thought about it intellectually too much beyond, firstly, the people who I hear it from and the narrative, the way it's discussed, I always find it a bit self-indulgent and almost selfish. I was saying to Angarika yesterday that I've got a friend whose younger sister seems to always just do what she wants, and she's very much like, you know, I don't need to rely on other people. I'll do what I want. And the way her sister, her elder sister, spoke about her as if this was some virtuous thing, like, oh, good for her. She just does what she wants. She doesn't rely on anyone, and she doesn't, you know, there was also an element of she does what she wants, even regardless of how it might impact other people. And I just thought, how can this be starting to be seen as virtuous? I mean, what is virtuous about that your own, yes, it's good not to rely entirely on people, that your well-being is completely dependent on the nature of your relationship with them or what's going on. You never want your contentment to be overly dependent on something out of your control. But it's just been pulled to such an extreme now that people are actually praising someone for just going for what they want, regardless of how it affects other people. I mean, that's just selfish, right? Like,
yeah, I feel like it's there's I find like a lot of selfishness also about the sort of the Seidu and the monk lifestyle. There's something really masturbatory about it. And I feel like the core truth underlying the Eastern religion, which I've found that a lot of people missed, was just get over yourself.
Yeah.
And sort of love without the need to be a burden, the love to be a burden on to whom you give your love.
Yeah.
And that's sort of an interesting way to balance it. But we do this very interesting thing, because it is so important to socialize. I mean, one of the things you talked about yesterday, which I was really happy about, was the impact of solitary confinement, right? And how modern, contemporary solitary confinement really, in its current form, was built almost like 170 years ago. I think the first case of contemporary solitary confinement where it's used en masse, no light, no sun for extended period of time, was in the United States in like the 1830s or something. They built like the first solitary confinement prison cell. But you have it as the most excessive form of torture. You know, I think any amount of time is torture. The UN says 15 days.
Yeah.
I think any amount of time. But yeah, it's interesting how when you spend so much time alone, you really start to unravel, in a sense, that the way that we've built ourselves, how we socialize, but probably even regardless of socialization, the ability to communicate with others is such an important aspect to our ability to function in our environments.
Yeah. With solitary confinement, you mentioned those, you know, that really hardcore, old school, dark, no light, thin walls, but I think now, because of course that is really terrible, but with the UN torture and, you know, what you see in some really high security prisons is you still, everything's the same. It's just not interaction with others. So now you can really isolate that. With the torture, they're defining solitary confinement. Everything external is the same. Your food's the same, your surroundings the same, your light's the same. But if you get less than an hour of exposure to another human for 15 days in a row, then they consider that solitary confinement. And there's a really nice TED talk by someone called Laura Rovner, who worked she did interviews with inmates of I think it's called ADX Supermax prison in Colorado. It's a high security prison, and solitary confinement happens a lot there. And they were talking about, I mean, the brain just comes completely dysfunctional. Some of them were talking about how the best part of their day, and they just wait there by the door obsessing, was when the guard walks across and they would see the shadow of the footsteps, because for whatever reason, that was the only analog to some form of social interaction they can get. Others would, you know, one of them found a dead fly who became like his best friend. And, you know, really, when you deprive someone or of this. It's bizarre. And then I always think of, it always raises questions to me. I'll be interested to see what you guys think. This is some seemingly fundamental part of the human condition. And then how does being an introvert or someone who really wants to be away from others fit into all of this? Or, I mean, autism has been a bit misunderstood in this sense, but there are, I think, subtypes of autism, if you were to type, I mean, it's not typed now, but where the individuals do have lower social motivation. A lot of them do have social motivation and just avoid socializing because they keep getting rejected. But the fact that some humans have very low social motivation or avoid it, what is it in Japan, something beginning with K, where they go and isolate themselves completely, like they won't leave their room. I can't remember what they're called. It's like the way social anxiety manifests there. But yeah, I just find it odd that you do get humans who really want to isolate themselves, when for the majority of humans, isolation, especially severe isolation, causes such profound distress. It's just a lot of extreme variability there with having this subset.
I do have a personal perspective on that. But there's also something else I think related to that I wanted to ask you. I'm going to start with my personal perspective on that, and then I follow with the question. It's just I think I am not so much socially. I don't rely so much in being surrounded by people all the time or visiting friends often, and that has been kind of my way to be for a very long time. Maybe I was different when I was a teenager, but what I perceive from myself is that most of the time I have one or two people that kind of like anchor me.
Yeah.
For the social interaction that I want and I appreciate to have. So I don't have to have a lot of social contact, but I have people that I kind of functions as anchors that I go to, I talk to, and that kind of like pieces me, like it just gives me peace, and that's enough. And then related to that and with the whole conversation is just like, what is the parallel between physical isolation and the actual and the perception of being alone in the terms of like, because of evolutionary psychiatry, just thinking about people that even though have social contact feel isolated. So how do you see the parallel then, like and how that plays out today? Because you might have kind of like a similar physiological response to that, but how that actually get to happen, right? So that's the thing, that how that get to be that you have people around you and you feel alone.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there just must be, I mean, so much of our responses, even physiological ones, are sort of mediated by narratives. So I think generally in biological systems, we sort of assume, right, there's some external stimuli which then activates some physiological response. And the complete lack of that stimuli can lead to a positive or negative response, or just, whatever, you shine light on some insect and it runs away, whatever. But then in humans and, may well be in other species, so much of we have those processes, of course, and then also there's something about the stories we tell ourselves and our perceptions, which then have real physiological impact, sort of maybe related to a cognitive scientists shouldn't use this word loosely, but like metacognition, our sort of higher level reflection on our life situation or an interaction or whatever. And then effectively our beliefs and our stories induce physiological changes and psychological changes. And that is a really interesting phenomenon, that you're sort of transcending this external to internal change, from internal to internal change, right? You've also got internal beliefs affecting internal.
But at the sociological level, how that say?
At the sociological level, sorry?
How that happened, that you feel disconnected, solitary, to the point of feeling the the physiological impact of it.
Oh,
to that point, like sociologically, how did you can be surrounded by people,
feel
feel
and
alone,
still feel
to the point of feeling the
yeah. Well, I wonder if it's. I guess there can be a genuine component to it that it is not. I mentioned here, the structural or functional. They often dissect sort of social life into. There's a difference between how many people you're around versus how many people would actually help you out, or how many people would actually support you and can you rely on. And of course, it's the qualitative nature that often is found to have a larger effect on health and than the reality of, you can feel isolated even if you're around hundreds of people every day, and at the biological level, fine, you're getting some response. You're exposed to all their smells and whatever, and there's some physiological reinforcement. Okay, I'm not isolated, but there's also the story of I don't really trust these people, or I can't rely on them, and that can make you feel alone. And then also there's just the sort of cognitive biases that emerge based on other aspects driving your mood state. If you're depressed for some entirely different reason, or some maybe genetic predisposition where even regardless of your life situation, you just keep falling into depression, then you see everything through that negative light. I mean, it's almost just being pessimistic, right? So, if someone who's majorly depressed can make pretty much a terrible story out of anything, or someone who, in the same way that someone anxious can have these responses to something that is quite distinct from reality, and they're sort of in a physiological state of hypervigilance. It's adaptive sometimes to be on the lookout and to be a bit paranoid rather than optimistic. It's good to be a bit paranoid sometimes. And then if you're in a if that system's a bit dysregulated, your physiological response is so far from the reality. And in the same way, when people are majorly depressed, their sort of interpretation and feeling and physiology is so distant from the reality of what's going on. And
there's there's a whole bunch of stuff. There's really interesting stuff there. One is, it's interesting when people feel social anxiety. I think that's a marker of our intense sociability, right? Because if you didn't have any drive towards sociability, you'd walk around outside without feeling anything. Yeah. And so that's a really interesting point, is that we get introversion, but what we're seeing, I think, a lot of the time is that people just get a bit exhausted from managing themselves in social environments. It's not that they necessarily prefer themselves over other people. It's just that other people exhaust them a bit much. Yeah. So that social component ends up being huge. And even when we do choose to isolate ourselves, there's still a world out there. And I think that's an important point, where what you get in prison and in solitary confinement is a detachment from the world out there. Yeah. You can't be watching TV, scrolling on your phone and things like that, and communicating still with people, but from afar. And I think that's a really sort of important point, is even the access to books, material, radio, things like that end up being really important. Podcasts. But one of the really important things that you guys brought up is how when you're interacting in a large group, how if you feel as though you're not understood, then you really feel alone. And there's this really important disconnect between how I see myself and how I see myself as being seen in my environment. And if I was to walk around with you guys all day, but you were actively ignoring me, I would feel incredibly alone. I can be speaking at you, but if you don't pay attention to anything I say, then all of a sudden I'm isolated. And I think there's this core aspect to the ability to express and then have that expression be received and acknowledged. Yeah. You nod, say yes. I give you a poem, you go, yeah. A song, you listen.
I'm not so sure if that's the whole story.
Yeah, I think that's the center of it. But I'm interested to hear your feedback. I think but if you speak and I do not acknowledge, I don't think that's. I think that's there's a disconnect there. I have to, even if you are not acknowledging, but I know you are hearing it. You are behind a door and I hear silence and I'm like, they're listening. I think that is a really important point to it. And I think that's why people feel so relieved when being in something like a therapeutic situation. And I think that's why also art is so therapeutic and expression in public groups is so therapeutic.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking perhaps it has to do more with depression for sure, and the lenses that you see, the interactions that you're having. But I can think about people with loving families, like wife or husband, children, everybody surrounding them. They still feel alone. People that come to you asking for your help or helping you actively, and even though you feel alone.
Yeah, but that's still the same thing. I think that's still, you feel as though your needs are not being met by other people. You feel as though you're not understood. I think the loneliness is not sort of purely, I don't think that it's some abstract function that exists on its own. I think that it's created because you're like, okay, well, I'm focusing on everybody else. Nobody is focusing on me, or just the perception that that's the case, or that you're speaking and being understood. I think that in a situation where everybody's caring for each other actively, the likelihood that somebody feels really alone, I think that would be something pathological and not something that everybody shares.
Yes, that or the not being understood thing.
Yes.
So I agree.
There are
It's
pathologies, but
yeah, that's the other really key, that if people are actively providing you, and that's it makes sense to me. I can sort of imagine the depressed teenager. If people are actively being really supportive to you and want to help you, but it's just like, no, you don't understand. Feeling a disconnect because you feel like your subjective experience is just so different to them. And even when you're depressed and people really want to help, they're often people will put, well, that doesn't actually make me feel any better. Yeah, it's great to know, but actually it just makes me feel even more isolated because they don't understand what I'm going through. So there you can feel, again, it's the contradiction of the more you're around people, then the more isolated you feel, because it just reinforces to you how disconnected you are from one another.
Yeah, sometimes the worst thing you can feel is, oh, I understand what you're going through. Right. Because if you feel like they genuinely don't understand, that can really mess with you. Yeah. And it's sort of like you can almost explain it as like a fundamental difference in your priors. Like your prior beliefs going into a situation are going to impact your perception of people's interactions, the information that you're getting from your environment. If your priors and I think that might be an interesting descriptive way, at least, to describe something like depression, is when your priors of your self-worth or your priors of other people understanding you are very low. You think that no matter what information comes through, they're weighted very heavily by priors that shifted in a direction of, okay, I'm going to be depressed. In the same way that your very high priors that something is going to go wrong is something almost pathological, where you have somebody who experiences anxiety or panic attacks, something where it's chronic. It's that they have an oversensitive threat detection mechanism that's sort of firing. If you can shift those priors back down, which is sort of the holy grail of anxiety research and cure and treatment, then you can sort of solve the problem. And I'm not asserting that this is exactly ontologically the case, but I think that descriptively it offers an interesting model.
Yeah. Now that you're talking about priors, you guys will definitely be able to help explain this to me. Completely different note, but the prize got me thinking. So I heard recently, in school, when you're learning about how we interact with the environment, it's like, okay, light have different wavelengths, and then our rods and cones pick it up, and then we create the color. And you basically construct this image based on the external stimuli you're exposed to. And it's a sort of, here are the stimuli, build his image. So I recently heard that actually the way perception works is Bayesian, and you've got priors, and you hallucinate reality, and then you use the stimuli to constantly update your priors and constantly update that hallucination. So you're not actually building from the stimuli, you're building the hallucination and then using the stimuli to refine it. I mean, is that a thing, and have I understood it correctly?
I think Ohan can go much wider on that than me, for sure.
This is like the crux of my theoretical work, is the predictive brain model. Okay. Where the brain is predicting its environment more than it's perceiving its environment. Like in that, at least, the proportion to which your internal experience is perceived rather than predicted is shifted in a novel direction from what we thought theoretically earlier. In that previously it was thought that obviously everything is external stimuli. The external stimuli comes in, your brain reconstructs it, and that's how you navigate your environment. But it doesn't seem like that's accurate. And there's a growing trend. I'd say it's probably one of the larger camps, if not the largest camp at this point, in perception research in cognitive psychology. Something called psychophysics, which I think is a really shitty name that sounds like it's pseudoscience, but it's literally the physics of psychology.
Okay.
But this is looking at how the environment is reconstructed, and it seems like prediction is the best way to count both from the energy budget that the brain actually uses, so how to metabolically account for it, but then also how to account for it from an informational perspective, in that there's so much information that processing all of it, reconstructing it is way more intensive than actually just predicting a state every time you move and then having that state be adjusted by the internal stimuli. That's how you get something like errors of expectation, illusions, visual illusions. How you get, say, hallucinations on something like psychedelics. There is something like an anticipation. And then what's being brought in by the degree of uncertainty is the perception. The information coming in is tainted by the amount of uncertainty in the situation. If I'm in a rush, if I'm running for the bus, I might not see as much around me. If I'm feeling really anxious, there's a whole set of work on pattern perception where the more uncertain I feel, both in a social sense, which is really interesting, and in a physical sense, in both cases, the more patterns I perceive. Right. So the most socially uncertain I am, the more patterns I'm going to perceive in the social environment. Oh, I feel like these guys don't like me. I think they're laughing, and I think they're laughing with each other at me. In the same sense of, oh, I'm scared and it's dark, and oh, was that a snake? So in the same sense that I can be physically uncertain, I can be socially uncertain, and then I will overpredict.
Yeah.
Wait,
but if you're uncertain, sorry, I missed part of the end, and that sounded really interesting. But if you're in an uncertain environment, then your priors shouldn't be as strong, right? And you should rely more on actual perception. I mean, isn't that what would be adaptive? If you don't know what to expect, your priors should be more relaxed.
It's that you're in a higher anxiety state, and your threat detection mechanism is almost like ticked up.
Okay, yeah.
Think about it that way.
Oh, I see. Okay,
yeah.
So this is just, there's uncertainty. Let's just err on
the side of caution. And so what you overpredict when you're uncertain is not, oh, I'm anxious, everything is probably okay.
Yeah.
It is most likely a snake. Most likely it is a snake. That's
your brain is saying, I'd rather predict an error. I'd rather overpredict an error. Yeah. So your signal to noise ratio shifts, and then you go like, okay, I'm gonna be more sensitive in my threat detection. And that you can account for all of this in sort of hierarchical Bayes model. It's literally I'm measuring my priors based on the likelihood, and then evidence in response to data. So it's more of a describing the brain's calculations as a statistics of uncertainty, rather than a construction of what is apparent.
Yes, and that it's funny. Initially, I was like, surely that's inefficient to keep adjust. But you're right. The amount of information to build a purely perception, to construct a perception based on all this information, when actually a lot of the time, right now, my external stimuli are staying relatively constant, so I can have very strong predictive power already, rather than every second build up a new picture. It probably is really, if I'm understanding correctly, it probably is much more efficient to have this process you're talking about go on.
So much more efficient. And you even, the amazing thing is, even because you were talking about visual perception, the parts of your eye that sense color are sort of right in the center of your vision. Outside of the center, you get less and less of the cones that construct color, and you're almost reconstructing color based on expectation in the outer sort of in the periphery, and that's really sort of phenomenal. And the other thing is, it takes so much effort. It takes so much energy to actually be aware of something, and that's a really difficult term. It's very hazy, but the ability to, I'd say, maintain and manipulate a symbol, like actively maintain and manipulate the symbol in your environment or information in your environment.
Right.
I'd say roughly that's a good way to think about awareness.
But what do you mean by manipulate information in your environment?
Like maintain the information and then actually use the information.
Okay.
That's what I mean by manipulate. Like manipulate it internally, so generate information from the information itself.
Okay, sure.
So as I'm aware of something, I'm taking in information, and then I can generate new information off of whatever I'm aware of.
Yeah.
I can, whether it's a thought or a thing in my environment.
Sure.
And that's obviously the most intensive, like calorically demanding aspect of what your brain does.
Right.
Is the you-ness. You know, and it's interesting how in moments when there's an immediate threat, that part is almost like bypassed. And people are like, I don't even remember what happened.
Yeah, yes.
I just did this thing.
Yeah.
I was falling down the stairs and I did a move.
Yeah.
I was going to crash and I steered away, you know.
Rage, blackout, like.
Yeah. And that blackout is almost like the you as a system being like, oh, that awareness is kind of pesky. Let's get it out of the way. It's going to fuck things up. Like it always does. Let's just do the thing and then we'll turn him back on later.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I've always thought about this, that this is what's going on. There's like a really intense situation. Everyone's like, oh, forget that. We don't need to bother with that right now. Let's just deal with what we've got to deal with. Although, interestingly, you get a similar self-report with creativity as well, right? People, you know, I've got a friend who's a composer and I'll be like, oh, wow, like that. And whenever he's been describing it, he's like, yeah, I didn't do that. Like, I don't remember what happened. Like, I didn't do that. And obviously that is when he's most relaxed. So it's in contrast, but the self-report sounds very similar to clearly a lot of very directed, appropriate action was taken and there's no memory of it. And that's either happening in a really extreme hyper anxious state or it happens in pure relaxation as well, which is strange. But yes, in both cases, it's like, let's not bother with thoughts. And because also thought, like especially linguistic thought, and you know, when we're using the information we get to build more information, like you were talking about, when that takes on language, I feel like that's the blocker of creativity, right? It's the opposite of flow. It's adding this new layer of interpretation or action. You know, I remember when I was a kid, I was always thinking too much when playing sport. And I remember once playing cricket, and I got really good at cricket that season. And then I just started thinking, like, how do I bowl? And then I just couldn't do it. I just kept bowling wides, and then I just never could play cricket again because every time I tried to bowl, it was in my head. And there's certain processes that thinking just gets in the way of, or some extra layer of processing or interpretation just gets in the way of. And that can happen at both extremes.
It's an interesting thing where my view on things is that what you're referring to is thinking, right? Without getting into too big of a description, thinking is what we think it is, right? Be super lazy about it, but I feel like that inhibition is the core part of that.
Yes, yeah.
Right, in that you carve a space between instinct and action in a very loose sense, very messy terms, but in terms of what you do without thinking about it, you wedge space in between. You're like, okay, I'm going to inhibit some things. And that's really bad when you need to do things very quickly. So it's really bad for sports. Yeah. It's really bad for performance. It's really bad for creation because what you're doing is overanalyzing. You don't need in that moment to manipulate your environment or you don't need to think about your thoughts. You'd rather just do. And I think that I definitely feel a lot of what you were saying about your friend with composing. When I'm writing a piece, the poems come out all at once. So it's like an intense moment of creation, and you really don't want anybody calling your persona forward in that moment. You don't want anybody. If I'm writing, I don't want you to be like, "Hey, Ohan," because that'll just like pull me in, and then inhibition comes in. that state of like flow is really just suspending the inhibition in that moment.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And animals are sort of there. Well,
all the time.
Yeah, I hate like lumping animals together the whole time. But I remember someone came for an interview once, and we had a primatology position opening, and she was looking at flow in primates, and I was like, I can't remember what she was, but I was like, aren't primates always in flow? Because isn't flow just that added value, that added layer of thinking? But actually, recently, again, this is really me thinking out loud, and it might be a preposterous idea. Or maybe it'll be such an obvious idea. Now, one of the things that probably pisses me off most in the world is the just profound underestimation of the social and emotional complexity of other species. Of course, you know, there's only so much you can say. Well, there's only so much I can say about your emotional complexity, right? What we can assume is their emotional complexity and just this sort of human superiority. I mean, it's just, you know, when people are surprised, like, oh, it's so human-like and whatever, like, especially, you know, when you think about parental investment in mammals and birds and all the likely emotional underpinnings that drive this. And I think I'm always good at really recognizing that. But one thing I think I've underestimated for some reason, or perhaps I haven't, is thought. And again, I'm sure you guys can tell me a lot about this, and I really should read more about it. I end up just reading the stuff that I'm writing papers on, and then I never get to actually explore stuff I'm interested in. But, you know, the relationship between language and thought, and because, you know, a chimpanzee doesn't have language, I think I have sort of, without actively and explicitly examining it, assumed that this sort of process wouldn't go on in their brain, that they wake up one morning and they go, not that guy. I'm going to spend a lot of time just over there so that I don't have to interact with him so much. He was really annoying me yesterday. Now, they don't have the complex syntax to have that process go on. But does that experience happen without words for them? Because I think I've always respected and recognized the complexity of their inner worlds and emotions and social cognition and intelligence. But as I say, in the back of my mind, I've never explicitly examined it, but I've sort of assumed that level of thought, let's call it, isn't going on. But then, of course, they plan, they're able to future plan. We know that, like chimps I'm talking about here. They've got social preferences. Why wouldn't they have that sort of concept or that sort of line of reasoning without it being verbalized? How much do you need the language to structure the thought? And do you think animals, let's just reduce it down, do you think a chimpanzee ever does that? Sort of gets up, sees Ohana, is like, oh, not that guy. I'm going to hang out around there because I know he doesn't really like it there, and then I won't have to deal with his shit today. Do you think a chimp ever has that?
Yes,
without words.
It's just that question, right? It's hard to see as a bat. Like, you imagine how does a bat see?
Yeah,
like, you just cannot. But the level of complexity, I think it does. It exists. I think it does. Perhaps, as you said before, I think maybe we like to value a little bit more the way that the humans think. So we have all of this words to define the thing. So it looks for us complex because we complexify it. So it looks like something that's appealing to us in terms of complexity. But that's just it. The rest of what the animals are doing are, for me, quite equivalent to that. So I don't know, just like Agustin Fuentes on his book saying that there was, I think, a chimp or a bonobo that was ostracized by the group, and then suddenly when he's taking notes on the field, it's just like this chimp, I think it's a chimp, that has been ostracized by the group, just leaned on him, like suddenly, because she was like so lonely, like, you know, like, and then we use the words, right? Lonely. I don't know if you should use the word, but what the primate's feeling over there, right? Or
I have no doubt they feel lonely and they think, oh, I want a hug, right?
Yeah,
or they feel
hug.
lonely and you see this when they're upset, they'll hug. They know that resolves the problem and have that instinctive. It's more, there's something a bit distinct about the example I gave compared to that, though. Perhaps because maybe it's just because it involves planning that I had discounted it, but I don't doubt that chimps plan all the time.
Yeah, like a barbarian macaque just bartering on Gibraltar,
right?
Like just how that could not, like, you can describe that in many different kind of ways for humans. Oh, that person likes that phone. I'm gonna get that phone, so I'm gonna get that biscuit from them. You can go on and on to describing how humans would do the bartering. But the barbarian macaque is doing the same thing at the end. Yeah,
but it is, the inner process is of interest. Whether it's consequential or not doesn't matter. But again, we don't know how low we can reduce consciousness down to in terms of, say, the animal kingdom. But if the Barbary macaque, if an ant is a robot and it feels the wind and has there's wind and it has some automatic response like a robot to move away, versus it has a sensation of the wind and then moves. So consequentially it's the same. But I am interested to know what that inner process is. Was it just some physiological reaction? Now, of course, we don't know that. But I guess what I'm saying is, with the Barbary macaque, I know it's impossible for me to understand what that inner process is. I don't even know where I'm going with this. I'm sort of asking an impossible question.
You know the work of Thomas Nagel? What's it like? I mean, I think there's a really interesting line of people who've thought about what it's like to have the inner sensation in general, and also like the ascription of inner sensation to other people. I think this is like a really good set of work. Like, the view from nowhere is a really interesting concept. But there's, it's almost like, do we want to dive into trying to understand the inner sensation, or do we want to actually describe the behavior? And I don't think that animals are just behavior, because I don't think that human cognition is fundamentally different from what other animals do. I think it's a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind. But I do think I guess because I kind of throw my hands up in the air at the fact that it's so unknowable, that I like descriptive accounts a lot more than sort of internal accounts of like, okay, well, there's a multi-step goal-oriented action that the macaque is engaging in, right? And that's pretty phenomenal, because not the complexity of the actions that an agent has to reach to accomplish to achieve a goal are vastly different based on the complexity of the species. Humans can achieve incredibly complex goals through a really complicated set of actions, whereas an ant might have a much smaller set of steps it can take in order to achieve a particular goal. But is it consciously maintaining the goal in its mind as it does it? Or is it driven towards the behaviors? I think is an interesting sort of question. But what I would feel bad if we didn't touch upon, use this as a segue to something like evolutionary psychiatry, because that you're so knowledgeable in that domain, and just to pick your brain a little bit on what that is and what your work is centered on, and because I find it super interesting.
Sure. Well, I think I would just categorize evolutionary psychiatry as, well, the fundamental question. I can't remember who I was saying this to yesterday, but the
last night over dinner,
question was just, mental disorders seemingly are here. Why haven't they been eliminated by natural selection? That's the question. And, in some cases that doesn't even make sense as a question, but that's your starting point as a question. Now, some people, and this isn't helped by the sort of popular media articles, automatically translate the premise of that question to, oh, well, mental illnesses must have some benefit, right? So that's definitely not what we're saying. Then the next step is, oh, this is a mismatch, sort of stuff I talked about yesterday. Like, we have some, psychological adaptations, which are adapted to a given environmental context or set of situations, and now we're in other situations and they're no longer adaptive. And I do think we rely on that too much. I mean, that's a real phenomenon. I'm interested in it, especially because I work with hunter-gatherers. But evolutionary psychiatry has a lot more to offer than that. So I'll give you an example, which I think is cool. Schizophrenia, right? Some people will be like, oh, well, schizophrenia, maybe being psychotic meant you were more likely to be a shaman and have high fitness or whatever. Okay, sure, that may well be the case, but let's just put that aside for a second. In many contexts, and I'm sure many contexts throughout history, being psychotic is probably not very good. It certainly can cause a lot of distress, and maybe you'll be ostracized. And certainly, as far as historical records go back, like written accounts, in most places, it's going to lead to, there's a massively reduced chance you actually get married and have a family and stuff. It's not fitness enhancing, right? Then we also know there is a strong genetic component to schizophrenia. It's one of the most heritable mental illnesses. So there you've got this really fundamental paradox, right? You've got something which has a genetic basis and reduces fitness. This is the ideal sort of manifestation of that question. How can it persist? That's a paradox. Now, one of the answers to this, I think, is schizophrenia is highly polygenic. So there are hundreds, thousands maybe of genes which can have some minor incremental risk, increase your risk incrementally. What's even more strange is if you look at genetic studies, a bunch of these risk alleles actually have signatures that they've undergone positive selection. But because it's so polygenic, these genes on their own may provide advantages. Like there seems to be the case that people with certain risk alleles for schizophrenia are more creative or better with language use or problem solve in a slightly different way that could be useful in certain contexts. So you've got these genes, and some of them are actually pretty helpful on their own. But if you happen to have the unlucky mix of having too many of them or the wrong combination of them, then it can have a pathological consequence. So this is one way. Theory of mind is actually a good one, right? So theory of mind is so important in human and primate social evolution generally. And alleles, genetic predispositions that enhance your ability to interpret others' mind states or pay attention to other people's mind states would be useful. But what if you just had too many of them? Randolph Nessy talks about a cliff edge. It's great to be paying attention to other people's mental states and interpreting them. But if you have too many of these genes which happen to contribute to that, you're going to start hyper-interpreting and get paranoid schizophrenia, right? So you're ascribing intention when it's not even there. So this is a sort of explanation how we can resolve that paradox. We can see that these risk alleles have on their own or in small combinations or the right combinations have positive effects, so they could persist or even become more prevalent in a population. But then it also allows for that vulnerability to be there because some people have the wrong combinations or too many. And what could make that worse is assortative mating. So I'm doing a study at the moment where basically I'm seeing if people who reproduce together tend to have similar cognitive styles with respect to certain traits that we could broadly see as perhaps related to schizophrenia or paranoid schizophrenia. So like agency detection, ascribing agency. So we've got these it's a biological motion detection task. I mean, you're in a cognitive science institute, you'll know all of it. Like they're moving dots, and then sometimes there's a human figure actually embedded, sometimes they're not, and you see whether they ascribe the human figure or not, or whether they make false positive or false negative errors. Auditory tasks where it's white noise, and sometimes we embed voices and we see whether they hear the voices. Emotion recognition tasks, do they not only correctly ascribe emotions, but how likely are they to falsely ascribe threat? And again, all of these things can be useful, and sometimes making some false positive errors can be useful. being more creative can be useful. But if your parents both have loads of these alleles and you're sort of inheriting dispositions towards always ascribing agency or always ascribing intention or having way too much threat detection, then maybe that can become pathological. So yes, I've rambled on a bit.
No, that's amazing.
It's super interesting.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you for two more things. One is I'm going to give a rough paraphrasing of something you said yesterday, which I think is really important, and then you correct that. And then I'm going to ask you to speak about one more thing. But one is that you're working on maladaptivity, and I love how you started the talk yesterday, which was you work on maladaptivity, and that's a really important thing to study. But also, it's really important not to turn everything into maladaptivity.
Yeah.
So you really have to have an understanding of like, yeah, we're doing certain things that we haven't evolved well to deal with. But that's also not an explanation of everything human beings do and also everything human beings suffer through. So you can correct that. And then one thing I also want you to lead into, and then we'll have to cut it off, is you're doing some amazing work with motherhood and NHS, just in terms of how people perceive motherhood and the alloparenting styles and how important it is to put parenting in the context of how humans began socializing and began parenting, probably. So yeah, please.
Just an ending note from my side as well.
Yes.
It starts to stress me out how mismatch is used as a joker card.
Exactly. That's the thing.
Okay,
yeah.
Is a mismatch again? So
yeah. So I think I touched on that a moment ago when talking about evolutionary psychiatry. The first misinterpretation is, we're saying all mental disorders are adaptive. And then the next thing is, yes, I do think mismatch sometimes occur, but it's just become like, everything's mismatch, and it's the default. It's become a null hypothesis. Like, well, if we don't know what it is, it's a mismatch. Yes. And that's really tiresome. And actually some of the things I discussed yesterday, if I really were to go into it, I wouldn't even call that evolutionary mismatch. That term, I'm writing a paper on many different things which people call evolutionary mismatch and maybe haven't even unpacked that they're talking about different things. But yes, I think there's such an over-reliance on mismatch, and then the degree to which that's entered public discourse is just insane. And when mismatch explanations are given, not only do we over-rely on them, they're predicated on assumptions about the type of lifestyles we are adapted to that are completely at odds with genetic, archaeological, and anthropological evidence of how we reconstruct past environments. So, they're often based around ideas of really extreme dominance hierarchies or really extreme polygamy or polygyny,
sexual selection,
patriarchy, all of these things that are completely at odds with what we think is the case of how ancestral societies lived. Of course, there was so much variation, but it certainly doesn't fit the normative model. So that's also frustrating. But I'm with you on that. That was also your first question, right? To a large degree. Yes, we shouldn't always go on mismatch.
But then the work that you're doing with alloparenting and putting that in a contemporary context.
Yeah, so I think also, one of the objections, not objections, but questions people would have about evolutionary psychiatry is, okay, maybe it's interesting, but is there any usefulness? I think there is, and I won't go into, we probably don't have time to go into why, but I'll just say one of the uses which is related to your question is that I think it can have a therapeutic value in and of itself. The classic example being what we've spoken about, this smoke detector principle that it's better to be just explaining to a patient that it's better to make a false positive error, and this would have been helpful over our evolutionary history. Generally, it's less costly to think there's some danger. You wouldn't design a smoke alarm to be an optimist. You design it to be paranoid. And that reframing seems to offer therapeutic value. And then the work we're doing with the NHS is trying to combat these narratives which actually have evolutionary undertones to them, that what's natural is that women have this maternal instinct and therefore they know exactly how to look after kids straight away. They should be able to handle it and manage it by themselves. And also one of the sort of misinterpretations or at least extrapolations that's come out of attachment theory is the idea of a primary caregiver, that the child becomes attached to one primary caregiver. And that now a lot of people and a lot of attachment theorists don't even think that's the case, but some would have said that, and sometimes it's been extrapolated outside of attachment theorists and been interpreted in that way, because the concept of primary caregiver, which does exist, was sort of overinterpreted. So we've got these narratives around the idea that women, mothers are the primary caregiver. They should be knowing what to do. They've got their maternal instinct. They should be able to manage alone. That's what makes you a woman to some degree. In some circles, they would, certainly in certain cultures, if you can't manage as a mother, you wouldn't even be your womanhood would be questioned. So what the psychiatrists I work with report a lot is that what's really common is you get mothers with postnatal depression who feel very guilty. They think something's wrong with them. They think they're really bad parents. They're ashamed and may have taken a long time to seek help in the first place because they're too embarrassed and they think something's wrong with them. So we are working, and we've just started this project. We haven't even done the focus groups yet. We've got through the permissions stages now, more or less, and got the team together. We're going to work and run these focus groups with mothers who have had postnatal depression and ideally who have expressed these sort of symptoms or these narratives of feeling guilty and that they were inadequate. And we're going to show them some of the research, both the theoretical work on how important collaboration in child rearing has been in our evolutionary history, how much, just some of the data on how many people are involved in caregiving, some ethnographic examples and pictures, and work with them to work out what information do they think would be useful and help combat those narratives for women who are feeling guilty or ashamed or too embarrassed to seek help or like something's wrong with them, and build a sort of information sheet or leaflet or pamphlet which we can then give to either new mothers or mothers who are going to this NHS trust, to the perinatal psychiatry team. And then eventually we test whether there are any therapeutic benefits to this, and we'll see how it goes.
That's amazing.
Cool.
I love that you're able to take the research and also apply it. I think that's sort of the holy grail of academic work. So I really appreciate that you're doing that.
Cheers. Thanks.
Dude, we could. I feel like we could talk forever. But
there's so many things about. I have to talk to you again sometime because there are things that I sort of intuitively feel you guys will have a lot of opinions on, which I'm just starting to explore now. Particularly the nature of the self and the idea of, there's no driver and we pop in like. Every so often we pop in the sense of, oh, I'm doing this, and it creates a stable sense of self. And anyway, for another time.
Definitely. But thank you so much.
I would like to repeat that at some point again. Have another talk with you because that was great.
I
really enjoyed talking to you guys too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikhil.
Thank you.
Cheers.